Ooh, it's cold in here. It's that time of year again, and for a lot of you, you are thinking about how you can keep your worms warm. Some of you have your worms outside, some of you may have your worms in your basement. Maybe your basement is colder than the rest of your house, or maybe you have them in your garage, a shed. But irrespective of where you have your worms, if you're in a cold climate, it is so important that we keep our worms warm, because once the temperature starts to go below 15, once it reaches 10 degrees, your worms are going to slow right down, almost to an hibernative state where they won't be reproducing as much as you'd like them to. They won't be consuming the food and making the castings as much as you'd like them to. And if it goes much lower than that, then your worms can start dying off. So you're wondering, how can I keep my worms warm? Hi, I'm White Davy, and that is a topic that we are going to be discussing in today's video. How can you keep your worms warm? How you keep your worms warm depends on where you are located. So here in Canada, if you're in Saskatchewan, then definitely your worms cannot be outside. They won't survive it. If you're in places like some areas of British Columbia, then your worms may be able to stay outside for the entire winter. So depending on where you live, that is going to determine how much effort you need to put into keeping your worms warm. So here are some tips that you can use to keep your worms warm. If you are in places that are frigid or even colder than Saskatchewan, then definitely your worms cannot be outside. And if your worms are going to be outside, chances are you are going to have to pile up a lot of bales of hay around that worm bin. And when I say a lot, I mean a lot, in order to keep them warm. You may, if you're not in areas that are frigid but they're cold, but frigids differ from person to person anyway. As you know, our skin color is not designed for cold. So what is cold to me is not really as cold to people with lighter color complexion. But anyway, they say if you feel cold, chances are your worms feel cold too. So if you're in an environment where your worms are not, where you are feeling cold or chilly, then chances are your worms are too. Now, it is said that the temperature outside and the temperature inside your bin can vary by 10 degrees. So how can you keep your worm bins warm? Insulated blanket is one option for keeping your worms warm. Another option that can be used to keep your worms warm is pocket feeding foods that are nitrogen rich. So those type of food tend to heat up and produce a certain amount of heat. But when you're feeding your worms these type of foods, there are a few things that you need to keep in mind, especially during the colder months. One, if you're going to be feeding and your worms are in an environment that is on the colder side, it means that they're going to be slowing down somewhat, which means that they're not going to be consuming the food as fast as you would like them to. So therefore, even though you're using the food for heat, it is important then that you monitor how much you give them. One, you don't want the food to stay there too long and become anaerobic. And two, if the food is there for too long, it may start to attract things like rodents or other pests, which is something that you would definitely want to avoid. Now, also when you're pocket feeding to produce heat in your bin, it is important that, as the term suggests, you put a portion of food in a certain location, leave space around that area so that in case the food should heat up to the point where it's too hot for your worms, they will have somewhere where they can branch away from the heat source. And if you have a large bin, as let's see if I can turn this around and show you. So behind you there, where you're looking at the camera, that is a vermicomposting bin that is below this tray, and that is a larger bin, 30 inches by 8 feet. And so for bins like those that are so big, You can place pockets of food at multiple locations in the bin, which is going to make it even better at keeping the bin warm. Now, if you're using small bins like the ones that you see on the shelf behind us there, so if you're I am I'm laughing at myself. So I am pointing at the bins that you're seeing, but I am pointing that direction and not this direction. Yes, I know I'm silly. Anyway, yes, so if you're using bins like these, then what is going to happen is these bins are small, so monitoring how much food you put in there is important, because there's not a lot of room for your worms to run if you put a large portion of nitrogen rich food in here. Now, another thing is very important to consider also, if you're using worm chow like rice or cereal, grains, these things also do produce heat, so monitor how much you give to your worms. Next is using a heater in the area that you have your worms. And so let's adjust this. Using a heater like that, or a larger one depending on the space you're trying to heat. Or if we look over here, these are just placed here for demonstrative purposes. You can use heat mats underneath your worm bin as well. Those are very effective. So if you're going to be using things like heated blanket or just a regular blanket, put it over your worm bin, it is so important that you ensure that the bin can get sufficient air. One, especially if it is heated, because that heat is going to stay underneath there and build up, and you won't have enough airflow to circulate the heat around, which may result in the bin getting too hot and affecting your worms, or the airflow being restricted and then harming your worms. So you don't want to be like those prescription medication that we get, and when you look at the medication, it says okay, it helps with 1, 2, 3, and then when you look at the side effects, you see like 50, 60, 100 different side effects, and you're thinking, why am I taking this? So when you're thinking about solutions for heating your worms, keeping them warm during the winter, try to find the solution that works best for you and is safe for your worms, because we don't want to be trying one thing and end up failing. And if you have small bins, very small bins, sometimes it doesn't hurt to move them from the area where they're at, if possible, and putting them somewhere in your house where it is warm. If you're going to be doing that, however, it is important that you ensure that your worm bin is aesthetically pleasing, not attracting fruit flies or other rodents, not smelly, because unless you live alone, you may have your family members complaining a lot. So keep that in mind. So if you have small bins like these tiny bins that I use whenever I am doing little worm kits, then you can always just stick them underneath your bed. Your bedroom will be warm. And if you're new to worm farming, you might be wondering, won't the worms be crawling out in my room? And I don't like that. The only way your worms will leave your worm bin is if the condition in their worm bin is not ideal. So if they have enough food, they're not cold, they have enough space, enough moisture, the pH is right, and enough airflow, your worms are not going to be leaving your bin. So you need not worry about that. Some of you who are watching this video might be at the stage where you haven't started a worm bin yet, and so you're thinking of getting started, and because it is winter, you're watching this video to ensure that when you start, you can keep your worms warm. But then you might also be wondering, how do I start a worm bin? And so in our next worm farming video, that is what we're going to be discussing. So if you are interested in seeing these videos, then don't forget to subscribe and turn on your notifications so you can get alert whenever these videos are uploaded. So thank you so much for watching, and I hope you have yourself a wonderful day. Yeah man, a time for grow.